Is Dr. Julia Hum, and it's my pleasure today to share with you an experience I've had with a learning tool called Draw It to Know It. In being asked to speak today, we settled on the topic of renal physiology, as it was a topic that the APS recommended as an area where it's a very complex organ of physiological function. And it's something that I teach in the course of educating our graduate students here at Marian University. So we came up with a title that's pretty cheeky, Making Renal Physiology Education Less Convoluted. I've included my email address below. I'm happy to follow up about any topics that we cover today, as well as if you want to get a glimpse of what we do here at Marian in our master's program. We're pretty active on X, which once was Twitter. So a little bit of overview for today. I'll give a brief introduction of myself and tell you how I became familiar with Draw It to Know It, how I implement it in our courses here in the Wood College of Osteopathic Medicine. I'll give you a demo of one of our modules that we use. And then thank you for pulling and buzzing in there. It looks like we're going to be covering the RAS regulation of glomerular filtration rate. So we'll build out that module together. And then we'll save time for some questions and answers today. I have a couple of disclosures. So my employer, Marian University, is a paid subscriber to Draw It to Know It. And to share my experiences today, I've received an honorarium. So just a little bit about myself. As an educator, I did my own training at St. Mary's College in South Bend, Indiana. I studied biology, played collegiate basketball, so I had a lot of cold bus rides up to Michigan. And then about my senior year of undergrad, I had a fantastic physiology professor at St. Mary's by the name of Dr. Nancy Neckvisill. And Dr. N is the reason that I decided to pursue my PhD in physiology with a long-term goal of being at a primary teaching institution. I did my graduate training at the Indiana University School of Medicine in cellular and integrative physiology department. I studied the mechanotransduction of bone. So how do physical stimuli like weightlifting, like tennis playing, turn a mechanical signal to a chemical signal that's interpreted by bone, with the long-term goal of promoting anabolic bone gain, which is known to be elicited by mechanotransduction, so that we could maybe eventually design a drug so that someone experiencing postmenopausal osteoporosis doesn't have to lift weights to anabolically build bone. And then I continued my studies at Indiana University School of Medicine in the Medical and Molecular Genetics Department. And there is where I first interfaced with renal physiology as a course of study. So I studied mineral metabolism and handling by both kidney and bone. And after that, I was fortunate to be able to be in the right place at the right time to be hired into my first faculty position in the same city. So I've been pretty fortunate to be in Indianapolis for both my graduate training and then my first position as a faculty member here at Marian University, and specifically in the Wood College of Osteopathic Medicine, where I am also the program director for a master's program in biomedical sciences. And so I have the good fortune of teaching mostly graduate students, and then I also teach some of our DO students in the first and second year of their curriculum. Before we get started, I want to give a shout out to the Indiana Physiological Society, my home society and my connection to the American Physiological Society. I had the good fortune of actually being a graduate student when the very first inaugural meeting happened at the Indiana University School of Medicine. And life has a way of coming full circle. And in 2022, I was able to serve as the Indiana Physiological Society's president, and was even more fortunate to be able to convince Dr. Clintoria Williams, another renal rock star that we all know, to join us for our keynote address, where she shared her cutting-edge work as to the regulating factor of zinc in renal physiology. So I think it's important before we dive into this teaching tool specifically for teaching renal physiology to talk a little bit about our learners, because I know a lot of the participants today, their learners going to vary. You might be teaching undergrad students, you might be teaching high school students, or you might be teaching medical students. And while some learners' needs are all the same, there are distinct differences. So these smiling faces here are the learners that I get to interact with on a daily basis. There are our graduate students in the biomedical master's program. And a lot of these students come to our program having had an undergrad major, usually in the sciences, but not always. And oftentimes they have a goal beyond our program. So most often it's something in the health professions like medical school, dental school, PT, PA, and either they might be doing a little pivot toward the health professions where they need more of a foundation in biomedical sciences before going on to further training, or maybe they haven't gotten into their program yet. And so they're using our curriculum to be able to elevate their credentials to show that they're ready for the next step in their careers. So our students come to us in the BMS program highly engaged, quite vulnerable in where they are in their career, and looking for an opportunity to grow as learners. And so keep that in mind as we share the tool Draw It to Know It today. And my perspective will be to bringing this tool to our graduate students. So a little bit about my background with Draw It to Know It. So I was a brand new faculty member in pre-COVID time. So 2016, 2017 was my first year at Marian University. So a big shout out to anyone that's attending or watching this that is an early career instructor, because you can do it, keep going. This might be a great tool to help support your learners as well as your teaching. And so it was at this time that I was aware that our university had an institutional subscription to Draw It to Know It, which then was made even better by learning that it was a local company to Indianapolis. So I was able to meet with Draw It to Know It to learn more about their tools for learning. And it was at this time, kind of early in my career, I required our students to view certain modules. And so they did earn small course credit. So there is the feature to be able to track viewing of your students and engagement with these modules, which can be really helpful if you decide to have students earn course credit for it. And then I feel like it kind of upped my Draw It to Know It game through interaction and support from Chris Bishop, our Marian University health professions librarian. So we all know how much, especially those that are instructors, we love our librarians. So this is another key interaction in my development with Draw It to Know It, was working with Chris to learn more about the tool. And this is when I started assigning pre-lecture Draw It to Know It modules, where I was more tailoring the module to the pre-lecture learning goals. And then from there, what I'll mostly highlight today is kind of where I am now, and working with Amy Harris, who is the scientific writer and just the module guru, is someone who's wonderful to help answer your questions about the modules and how you can customize them for your learner, so that when they go to their page, it just shows the modules you want. Because as I'll show you later on, there are a lot of topics with Draw It to Know It. We've picked renal physiology, but being able to customize these modules so your learners go right to the module that you want them to engage with, either pre or post lecture, is really, really helpful. So this is when we started using more of the custom course. So as you'll see on when I share my screen on their web platform, there's literally a Dr. Hum medical physiology and pharmacology tab. And this allowed our learners to then at Marian, using their Marian email addresses, basically subscribe to this course. There's a pin, and so we get them all set up so that I can then embed links on our LMS system. Here at Marian, we use Canvas, so that they can go right to the modules that we want them to learn from. And I also, kind of back to that leveling up theme, started using more of the resources to aid in my teaching and my lecturing. And so you'll see that there's the ability to use kind of starter images or even teaching slides that can be really helpful for not only instructor, but also a learner, that there's a continuity in the visuals that they're using to learn some of this really technical information. And as is so important in any teaching and learning, we want to be using the best practices. And so 4 of those that I find that I frequent in my course design, as well as executing that instruction, are retrieval practice. So making sure that we're giving learners opportunities to see what they learned. We tell our graduate students, to have a lot of high passes with the material, to put the slides away or the textbook away and write out as much as they can from memory. It's uncomfortable, but that active retrieval is more of like how you're tested in our program. We're a multiple choice test. And so being uncomfortable while you're studying is going to make you a lot more comfortable during the exam. Space practice. So this is, frequent passes at material, usually in smaller chunks, right? So I cringe if one of our learners says, oh, I just re-listened to all of the lectures, right? That's not active enough. And you're spending almost too much time on one subject. We want you to be hopping around and spacing out how many passes you're getting at material. And then interleaving. This is so important. And for our learners who, obviously want to perform well on their exams, to be able to enhance their credentials, interleaving, we encourage them to think, to study like they're tested, and you're tested randomly. Across those multiple choice questions, we might be hopping around from lecture 6 to lecture 2 to lecture 3 to lecture 7. So you should be doing that in your studying as well. And if you really want to elevate it, start jumping around across different subjects in our curriculum. So not just the course that I instruct in, medical physiology and pharmacology, but do anatomy, then do immunology, and hop around, because then you're really leveling up your studying. And then of course, feedback is so important, for both teaching and learning. For our learners, that can come in the form of quizzes, obviously exam grades, is feedback to let them know kind of where they are in their learning and preparations for exam. And with these 4 kind of best practices that I try to use in all of our lessons and course design, there are connections to the learning tool Draw It to Know It. So what I'll show you today is Draw It to Know It's ability to promote retrieval practice, promote space practice, promote interleaving, and feedback, which I think makes this a complementary tool to the goals I know of my course that I instruct in. And I think that's a question that we all ask ourselves, right, as faculty members and instructors, is there's a lot of great ed tech out there, right? It's really exciting, always evolving field. But at some time you almost get ed tech fatigue, right? With all the new tools and trying to understand, gosh, what can I incorporate authentically and not just throw something at my learners and bombard them with resources. So it's always that balance, you're looking for as an educator. And I feel like I've found that balance over time with Draw It to Know It. So let's talk about some of the resources for instructors. There's the ability to pick and choose these modules to fit your curriculum, which is really helpful for both pre and post lecture activities, so that you can really seamlessly incorporate them into your content that you'll be covering. As I mentioned before, the starter images and teaching slides, particularly for some of our new faculty members, can really help. I am sure you can relate to some of your first teaching experiences where you're making slides and content, right? And it's an overwhelming process. Well, this is something that I wish I definitely had, is some of these starter images, teaching slides to use alongside of those other images to help ground the learner in what the expectations are for that material. And then certainly practice questions are huge. I know, when you're writing exam questions and quiz questions for your courses, that's a lot of effort to write really good questions, right? And so having the ability to have these modules also have quizzing features is great twofold, both for the learner to be able to have some of that active retrieval and feedback on how they're doing on the quizzes, but also it buys you a little bit of time back and being able to focus on the quizzes that may be part of the courses or the exam or the learning activities, all the other things that go into planning courses. And there's not only practice questions for smaller modules, maybe one topic, but as we build out, I'll show you these custom modules, it will then make a subject exam. So this can be hundreds of questions depending how many modules are in that custom module, which is really, really helpful to the learners to be able to do these this active retrieval. And then there's the ability to track your learners. If you would like to, at minimum, see how much they're engaging with material, or if you want to give them course credit for completing modules, that would be an option with some of the institutional features that instructors have access to. So let's dive in as to how we use Draw It to Know It in our medical physiology and pharmacology course. So I've taken screenshots of our syllabus here to let you know how we kind of onboard students to Draw It to Know It and then how we use it. So this is right from our syllabus here. We just mentioned that it's mostly a pre-lecture learning activity as we outline it in the syllabus, but obviously they can use it across the course. And then there's a link to, literally, you can see in here, our BMS Medical Physiology and Pharmacology course here. And then we have a course pin. That ensures that our learners match the right year, because I've used this now going back to, I think it was 2021 or so, or 2020. And so that pin then also allows me to flip across those different years that we've used it to see engagement, to see what modules are used a lot versus those that maybe weren't interacted with to the same extent. And then if you were to look at our syllabus for this course, I've just taken a section of it here that relates to our topic today. So you can see in the spring semester here, we have a block of renal physiology and pharmacology. And over here to the right, we have our recommended reading, whether it's our assigned phys or pharm text. And then you notice here's where we have a column for Draw It to Know It. And we've come up with a numbering system. So what this means, Draw It to Know It 5.9 simply means for respiratory physiology, they have a module that's week 5, lecture 9, which is where we get the 5.9 from. And they know if they go to that Canvas page, there's going to be a link to that respiratory physiology custom module. So let's skip down here to our topic today of renal physiology. And you can see over here to the right, we've got 6.12, week 6, lecture 12. And you'll also notice we incorporate what we call check-in quizzes. These are questions that I've made. They don't come from Draw It to Know It, but that feature of having additional questions per module means that all of well, actually it would be up here, but so really this this check-in quiz here that they would have upcoming, there's modules here that match with the upcoming check-in quiz. So you bet they're going to be using the quizzing feature here to prepare for their check-in quiz that we will be administering about this content. So if then they would go to our Canvas page, which as I mentioned at Marion is our LMS system, this is where we would have a page for instance, like lecture 13, and we would have posted our lecture material. I'll get back to the in-class notes, what that means. Our institution also uses Usia to record lectures, and here's where that Draw It to Know It module will be found. I'll also point out our learning objectives, because these are another thing that are so important to aid in our learners understanding the expectation for the content. And so it's another opportunity for that retrieval practice. We've taught them all about blooms and what these first words are associated with different level of bloom. Certainly explain, describe is much different than say, let's interpret. So we encourage our learners to use these learning objectives alongside our Draw It to Know It module, both in preparation for what the content will be for lecture, but then also for studying after the content has been delivered. So here's the workflow that is typical of a Draw It to Know It module in our course. So from the instructor's perspective, so pre-lecture, we would design and post a custom Draw It to Know It module. and we would expect our learners to then be accessing that. During lecture, this is where I've started to use those starter images so that the visuals start to match for our learners across platforms, whether they're on Canvas or on Draw It to Know It or in the classroom setting. And then from there, I'll post those starter images so that they have access to them on Canvas. And then we move on to the post lecture learning. From a student's perspective, the way they would interface with this process is they would pre-lecture, watch, draw that custom Draw It to Know It module. They might even utilize some of those quiz questions prior to formally learning about the content in our classroom. During lecture, I encourage them, but it's not required, to draw along with some of the images that we'll be highlighting. I find that drawing is helpful because it also intentionally slows me down. I can tend to get excited, talk quick, and so when I'm drawing something, I'm going to have to slow down. It allows our learners to write alongside of me as they are learning about this content. And then in that post-lecture phase, they would do very similar to what they did leading up to lecture. Go back, watch aspects of that module. They might or might not do more drawing. This is definitely when you'll see more of the quiz questions be utilized across our learners. And so here's a screenshot before we flip over to the web platform of what, for example, that renal module would look like. So our learners would have clicked on the link. It would bring them to an interface that would look like this. So when they log on, they'll say, okay, Dr. Hum selected 4 modules for this particular module ahead of us starting our renal section. And then they have the ability to go down these tutorials. So each one, it nicely denotes the time if they're just watching the tutorial. And then there's the feature that they can also take a quiz on just this particular module, or if they come down here, they can select subject exam, where it would take all the questions from these tutorials and allow them to go through those multiple choice questions. Our program uses multiple choice, so it's a nice pairing there for students to familiarize themselves with strategies of approaching multiple choice questions. Now, certainly this is my view here, so you can see my name up in the right hand here. There's a drop-down menu that we'll be using later on today to make one of our own modules, but this is generally what it would look like, and one of those custom modules that we would expect our students to be interacting with before lecture and after lecture. But it also allows them for some of those key habits, right? They can interleave by coming across these modules and picking them randomly. They have opportunities for retrieval practice in the form of these quizzes and subject exams. They certainly will get feedback as to how well they're doing across those quizzes, and those quizzes, as well as the drawings, which we'll highlight later, you can draw alongside these videos, allow for really active retrieval, right? Where they don't have all the information in front of them and they're seeing what they can retrieve based on what they've learned so far. Now here's, if you were going to go into one of those modules, this is the general overview of one of the learning topics in our renal physiology section that covers the basics of the nephron and the roles of reabsorption and secretion. And then over on the right here, you can see all the more convoluted topics, but a bunch, that relate to the absorption, reabsorption, and secretion that vary dramatically across the different sections of the nephron. So this is taken from those teaching slides. This is an example of this is also in the module, but you could download this as an instructor if you want to use aspects of this, which is a great way to provide some continuity where appropriate from your pre or post learning activities into the classroom. So for example, here's one of those starter images, right? So you can see a lot of the elements have been stripped away. And then from there, for example, one thing I've done is then take this nephron all stretched out that we see here. And the next slide that you'll see is something that I annotated during class. So they would have at least seen this module. Maybe they just viewed it and did some of the quiz features. And then as a general overview, something I love to do that I've started probably about 3 years ago is I use an iPad. You could also use, if your lectern has, the ability to annotate, I write out kind of the big take homes, topics for this given lecture. So obviously in each section of nephron, there's a lot more going on, but we are using that same grounding starting image here, and we go over some of the topics. And because it's live, right, this is the final image, right? So similar to Draw It to Know It, where it's an unfolding tutorial that's being narrated, we draw out some of the big subjects here. So you can see we've not only covered the idea of secretion and reabsorption, but we've labeled the big sections of the nephron. Because we're also a pharmacology course, this is a particularly helpful module because it covers some of the big classes of diuretics. And so we love pairing those subjects together because it matches the physiology with the pharmacology in the renal section so well when we dive into, for example, the thick ascending limb, and it has the sodium, chloride, potassium cotransporter, which is also targeted by our loop diuretics. And so let's zoom in there a little bit more in that thick ascending limb, because this is where a lot of action happens, right? Physiologically and pharmacologically. And here's another example of what students could interact with online, either prior or after this content. And you'll notice that, so I took these right from downloadable slides. And so it has animations to where it layers on the information. So we're zooming in here and talking about the thick ascending limb and how it works physiologically, the early distal tube versus the late distal tube, and some of the mechanisms that are similar and those that are different. And then where it's really great for the content I teach is it then layers on those diuretics and how they work as part of those sections. So this might be something, for example, that a student would look at ahead of class. They would then join our class. And in the past, we would draw. And I know this seems like, whoa, this is a lot of information here, right? But this would be what we would go through in class after they would already view those Draw It to Know It modules. I think one item that I could even improve on is orienting these the same way. I don't know why my brain tends to think of the nephron looking like this in terms of horizontal versus vertical. But I think it's also important for our graduate learners to understand that there's a directionality. So there's basal layer and apical layer, and whether they're horizontal or vertical, they are going to be able to understand and conceptualize the different sections of the nephron, the key players there, and then in our course, the diuretics that might target, key physiological players in those segments. Here's another example of what we would cover in the distal convoluted tubule, both early and late. Now, remember, again, this is a stagnant image, and we'll be writing this out together, which also allows for active retrievals. We go back through the drugs, and we maybe question what kind of diuretic would target the distal convoluted tubule, and what mechanism could it target, and how would that then promote diuresis, for example. So just before we go over to the platform, I want to highlight some strengths and limitations that I've found in this platform as I've used it over the years. Certainly some of the strengths are being able to pick modules to guide your learners within the scope of the material that you plan to cover. As you'll see when we switch over to the web-based platform, there's multiple modes of interaction, quizzes, tutorials that they can just watch, but also drawing either from blank slide or starter images. And then there's also instructor and institutional resources, which are really helpful for feedback, both as an instructor, but also from our learners, from doing quizzes and just testing themselves as to how much they can draw after having been exposed to this content. A couple limitations that we've found workarounds for would include matching the scope of modules with coursework. We've all seen, in designing curriculum, sometimes you go into more detail or less detail than a given module. So the way I get around that is just by putting that on Canvas. It might say, here's the Draw It to Know It module, and then there might be an asterisk underneath that says, we're not going to, for example, I'm thinking about a module we did recently as we started this course all over again. And some of the pharmacodynamics that are in a Draw It to Know It module, we don't go into nearly as much depth. I think it's great for our learners to hear that tutorial, but I just try to make it clear that there are some areas that Draw It to Know It might go into more detail or less detail, so that it's just clear with our learners. And then a feedback that I've gotten also from our students would be, the possibility to further customize quiz questions. So while there's quiz questions per module that then get pulled into a subject exam, sometimes when you don't get as much depth, maybe as some of what's covered within a module, there might be some quiz questions that a learner might look at and say, did we talk about that? And so that's another area where I just often put on Canvas that, if you read a quiz question from Draw It to Know It and you are at least familiar with what it's asking, that's probably a good question for active retrieval. But if it's a subject that maybe is a little bit deeper than we had time and is out of scope with our course, then just skip right over that question. And then I think it's important before we go see the platform to talk through some student feedback. So with our students, remember they're graduate learners, definitely have some favorite modules. So of course, renal, which is one reason why we picked that subject to highlight Draw It to Know It today. Cardiovascular is also great. How the heart works and the drugs that affect it are really complicated. And so our learners really like the cardiovascular as well as skeletal muscle. In particular, I'll highlight the cross-bridge cycling, right, as a core physiological concept of skeletal muscle contraction. And our learners just love the way Draw It to Know It lays it out for the skeletal muscle. And then taking a page of feedback from our anatomy professor, her students really like the embryology module. Embryology is often a topic that our graduate learners have not had in great detail, and so it allows them a lot of passes and exposure to this material that a lot of them haven't seen before. So it's a lot of new vocab to put together alongside their anatomy and histology courses. And then for our learners, they also love the MCAT prep resources. So remember, our learners are often in the midst of trying to get to their next program. So the MCAT prep tutorials that are on there are fantastic. And then we'll also give a shout out. There's also USMLE tutorials as well. So some of our current medical students, some of which were BMS students that become our own medical students, utilize the USMLE tutorials as well. Students are always going to love additional opportunities for practice questions. I think pre the occurrence of AI in the education space, this would have been some of their sole practice questions that they didn't generate. So this is taking on a different form now that students can have the ability to use AI to maybe generate some of their own practice questions, but this is always going to be something that students will ask for. And then, of course, the opportunity for active retrieval using those starting images as well as drawing alongside. So with that, I'm going to switch screens here and we're going to go finally look at our custom module. And then we're going to make sure we save time for your feedback to build out our own module. So let's take a look at that renal module that I mentioned as part of our course. Okay, so what you're seeing here is essentially the landing page if you went to drawitoknowit.com. And what I wanted to highlight here is just, again, that we are specifically focusing on renal, But if you're teaching across physiology, this is a great platform for a wide variety of subjects. So you can see here in the middle is that BMS custom course that has been really helpful to be able to make very specific modules for our learners. And then over here, there's a whole host of board preparation opportunities, which again will also, our learners are already familiar with this platform. So then to have some of these board prep opportunities is really fantastic. So let's go over to our custom module here. Okay, so this should look familiar from what I showed earlier, right? So this would be a study plan that our learners would be viewing pre-lecture, and we'd be using some of the starter images during lecture, and they'll definitely be going back after the lecture to review and try to practice some of this drawing. So I promise I'm not going to play a whole tutorial, but I would like to show you just the start of one so you can get an idea of what the learners have the opportunity to do in these custom modules. So this is one that I picked, and this would be coming into lecture for the first time, covering renal for the first time in our graduate course. So this is the overview. As you notice, if we go back, we're right here. So I've selected in this larger module here 4 topics that we want students to view prior to lecture. So that first one being this overview.
Here we'll learn an overview of the structures and functions of the kidneys. Part a table and denote key functions of the kidneys.
So you notice that you can speed up the feature if any of you use, or the narration, if any of you use video recording of your lectures, you know that that can be utilized by a lot of learners. I'm going to fast forward a little bit so you can start to see some of the images.
Also denote that they play roles in the production mechanisms. Indicate that the inner area is called the medulla and the outer area is called the cortex. Of total cardiac output goes to the kidneys. This allows for the kidneys falls too low, distal tubule. The distal tubules of multiple nephrons, drains, but they aren't all. Here we'll learn an overview.
So let me also show how it flipped back on me for just a second. There we go. So you can see this stagnant image here. And so oftentimes pre-lecture, students are taking this in. They often are not drawing until after our lectures, just because for a lot of them, this is content at a higher level than they've had maybe in undergrad. Maybe not this particular module, but as we get into how secretion happens, how reabsorption happens, those are new topics for them. So highlighting this feature here of being able to draw, this is awesome, right? So our learner can come in and on this web-based platform, use some of these images. Maybe they've viewed the tutorial already, and they can do active retrieval and trying to label these different structures here. So you can see on the left, there's opportunities to change up what's there, right? You can do a starter canvas. You can start from a blank canvas, or you can do a label canvas. And then you can download these so students can have the opportunity to either print them or have their own drawn images with these starter images available. Up at the top, you can see we can also navigate across the quizzing feature. So you can see that we have quizzes that are going to actively review topics from this particular module. As we navigate back, you can see there's more modules or tutorials within this module that we would want students to get through. Glomerular filtration rate, right? That is definitely can be a convoluted topic within renal physiology because there's a lot of pressure changes, right? That get regulated to promote glomerular filtration rate. So this could be another example where a student could draw alongside the video, right? So if you start the video here, I'm going to fast forward a little bit.
Water, which allows to activate, which we discussed later, of the
right here, look,
walls, and indicate
you can label alongside the annotation.
BS.
So let me go back because I want to make sure we keep plenty of time for our custom module here. Make sure I covered everything so far. I noticed that our second highest request was the sodium handling. So I'll just give you a preview of some of this, because this can be another pretty tricky topic because it can change, right, across the different sections of the nephron. So this was previewed a little bit in my PowerPoint slides. So with the time remaining, I see we're almost about 20 minutes till. Why don't we switch to showing you how to build a custom module? So let's build a module together using your feedback from that polling earlier. So the winner was the renin-angiotensin system's regulation of GFR. So let's navigate back here as if we're starting here. And so we would go to the renal system, knowing that maybe that's going to be our main lecture topic, right? We're going to go over here and we're going to create a new study plan. So right now we're just going to select the tutorials. Okay, so we go back and you notice because we went into renal, it's already going to just highlight the renal sections, not all the other different organs. And then we are focused on renal physiology, but as I scroll here, notice all the other topics within renal anatomy, embryology that are also capable of making modules for. So as we come down to renal physiology here, okay, and maybe this is the main topic of the day is the GFR regulation for here, and maybe we want to highlight we'll also include maybe the general overview, okay? So then we would select, you could do something just as minimal as this renin-angiotensin system, but select this, and then we're going to go here, okay? Now what our learners would see is just what we selected, okay? So they're not overwhelmed by all those topics. They have just the ones that we would like to highlight. And let's go right to that topic, which is pretty integrative, right, across renal physiology, in that it involves multiple organ systems. So this is what we would call the kind of the finished product here that a learner would see. But as we would take in this tutorial as a learner, it would build out.
Here we'll learn how the renin-angiotensin system regulates GFR. This hormonal response to low blood
I'm going to fast forward to
regulate the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which reduce vasoconstriction and lower blood pressure. To note that they include angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, ACE inhibitors, show that they inhibit ACE. Unfortunately, ACE inhibitors.
So let's pause it there, okay? So if we were a learner, this is what we'd be taking in. Certainly we have quizzes now that are going to relate to this topic for just this section. And then if we wanted to come back, right, we could use, a partially labeled diagram here to do retrieval practice, right? So what was that drug, that was mentioned that's in the bloodstream that affects this system, right? And you've got that little inhibitor here. That's our ACE inhibitor, right? I don't have a pen, so we're going to abbreviate, right? An ACE inhibitor. And then a student could, flip back and forth between, oh, there's the final image, here's the template, the starter image, and here's the labeled image. So it's going to be able to allow a learner to use these diagrams from the tutorial, and maybe as the educator, you used some of this in the course of your lecture, some of these images. So there's that familiarity with the content. Let's go back and highlight those features. So if we go back, there's a downloads option here. This is where you would navigate to, where if you wanted to download the drawing or the teaching slides, I find those to be particularly helpful. I've gotten feedback that some students just like to be able to also read the text alongside of these tutorials. So you can see real quickly, we can build out, an overview, which is similar to what we've already previewed, and then zoom right in to the renin-angiotensin system. We could then go to the subject exam. And as you see here, it has 31 questions. I don't know how many questions are on your exam, but that's effectively half an exam in our course. So students are able to click through these. And for example, if you can also get feedback as to the other learners being able to discriminate the correct answer. And then look at this feedback here of pointing a student, maybe they got it wrong. And they are going to then be pointed. There. Okay, so I incorrectly selected this answer. It's going to point you as to which module you need to go back to review that particular subject. The last thing I want to highlight here is just the ability to use these same images, and you can customize them. So I mentioned in the downloads, right, for instructors, there are oftentimes different versions. So if we were to download this image, you could download the version that does not have these labeled, so that the learner and you can have the opportunity to label them together to talk about their function. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. Well, you know what? I'll leave it up in case people want to look at other topics and turn it over for questions with the time we have remaining.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Dr. Helm. We have a few questions that have come in, and for those of you who have any questions, please feel free to submit using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So the first question is for full functionality, is a computer touchscreen required to draw these figures freehand?
So what would be required, so for example, right now I'm doing it on my Mac laptop. Our learners in our program are all issued an iPad, and so we've seen definitely an increase in the number of students that would use an iPad for these drawings, but this platform can be used across a variety of computers, so it does not require a touch screen.
Thank you. Our next question is, as far as your experience assigning Ditki drawings as graded assignments, they are wondering how labor intensive it would be to grade the images, correct misconceptions or errors as a part of a graded assignment.
Yeah, fantastic. I have not gone to that length of grading drawings. What I in past have used is viewing and quizzing those features. So that could be a great thing to bring back to the Draw It to Know It team of enhancing the capability. You can see images that have been drawn by learners, and I believe there's an export feature. I usually have about 70 students in my class, so it's time prohibitive. I found time prohibitive, but maybe in a smaller classroom could be really, really helpful.
Thank you. And the next question is related to actually, the use in terms of flipped classroom versus, teacher-led. And so, are the students, in your experience, are the students creating the drawings themselves, or as the instructor, do you kind of provide the drawings and then expect the students to label or answer questions?
Yeah, it's a great question. We see the highest engagement with viewing tutorials and quizzes. One of the reasons I wanted to bring these starter images into the classroom was to not only provide continuity on what the images that we're using in our class, but also to show them and make them make some of the images of their own, right? It's one thing to study an image from a textbook, right? But that doesn't always maybe show the context or the level of detail that maybe the instructor is going to be expecting. And so by crafting some of these drawings within our course, but then allowing that to be extended onto this web platform, would hopefully enhance their learning. Certainly, though, I wish that the level of drawings, was just as high as those viewing the tutorials. But I think, at least for our graduate learners, they're pulled across 5 classes that are all at the 500 level. We test in block format. So I think given maybe more time, they would engage more with the drawing features. And there's probably other learners that do, but we definitely see the engagement the highest with watching the tutorials and the quizzes.
So much for that. And then in that same vein, the next question is on student performance. So have you compared how well students learn the material using this tool? So for example, maybe comparing exam scores from classes before the tool was used with students currently,
Yeah.
or post-use.
That's a great question. And thinking like a scientist, I don't have a perfect intervention point, because when we really started using Draw It to Know It was also when we integrated this course to be both physiology and pharmacology. So I have done an analysis of going from the separated courses. So we had 2 years where physiology was taught in the fall and pharmacology was taught in the spring. And a lot of our learners haven't had any pharmacology prior to coming to our program. And so what I found doing practically was, like, in September, we'd be teaching the nephron, and then come March, we'd be teaching diuretics. And what would happen is we'd have to do at least a 20 to 30-minute review of the nephron in March that we learned in September. So I do have great data that integrating the course alongside using Draw It to Know It has improved not only student feedback, but also exam scores. But unfortunately, like my true scientist, heart would have preferred just one intervention, to be able to say it was only Draw It to Know It. But it did coincide along merging those courses, which means that Monday we might be doing the nephron. Wednesday we would then be doing the drugs as part of the different section of the nephron, and then Friday we would be covering a clinical case that relates to using diuretics.
Appreciate that. Thank you for that. And then this kind of goes into the unique nature of drawing as a mode of learning.
Yes.
And it is, what is your experience of the quality of drawing for student learning? So does quality count, or is the act of drawing the most meaningful part of the learning?
Sure. Yeah, great question. And the drawing extends outside of the Draw It to Know It platform. Here, just right outside my office, we have a couple big whiteboards that just the other day had, they were clearly probably students reviewing for board exam, had a giant kidney with all these processes mapped out. And so, drawing obviously is important, but it's the retrieval, right? The way that it's retrieved. And so quizzing, is definitely a form of retrieval, right? But in my opinion, drawing, labeling, which would relate to quality, but also correctness, right, is leveling up that retrieval. If a student wants to do quizzes over and over again that were given to them, that's good. That's active retrieval. But if a student is able to take a learning objective and say, diagram out the RAS pathway related to GFR, and they were able to then map out and label in some drugs as well, that is, as we share with them, that's leveling up ahead of exam expectations, because on the exam in our course, we're going to be doing multiple choice. So quality does matter, but even just the act of labeling, writing, that multisensory approach to learning, in my opinion, elevates that ability to retrieve come exam time.
Thank you for that. And this next question has to do with student feedback. Is student feedback on Ditki basically the same between DO and graduate students?
Great question. And so I don't have any formal feedback from our DO students, but I think the engagement and the depth of information is going to vary. From our program, they are in 16 credit hours, which is not nearly as many credit hours that our DO students are taking. And so the depth and breadth of information that is covered in our DO program, while overlaps with some of this, I think the learners at our DO program, they sometimes don't always feel they have the time for added resources. And so they might pop in to Draw It to Know It to view particular modules as they are reviewing information. But in my experience, and the way we've used it at the graduate level, it pairs really well with the expectations of learning in our curriculum.
Thanks, Dr. Hum. One last question. Do you assign textbook readings as well, or do you find that students generally aren't doing the readings anyway, but are already going through the videos on Ditki? So this is a sort of merging of videos and active reading.
Sure. So we use assigned recommended, we assign what we call recommended chapters in both physiology and pharmacology text. And so some of our lecture material is coming from those textbook chapters. In terms of level of engagement, it might be generational differences, preference in modes of learning, but we see a high level of pre-lecture engagement with these tutorials and modules. And so in my opinion, we're trying to meet the learner where they are. And a lot of our grad students are already going to the web. They're watching videos maybe on YouTube about subjects. And so this allows us to meet them there and guide them to these tutorials. It's not to say that textbooks are not important, because they are, and our lectures are grounded in textbook chapters. But at the end of the day, we want students to be learning the material. And so we find that meeting them here at Draw It to Know It to enhance their understanding has led to really good outcomes.
Thank you so much. And actually, we have time for one more question, and that is, have you had experience and differences between students doing the Ditki learning individually versus in small groups? And if so, were there any differences in their learning outcomes?
Yeah, great. I can't point to a head-to-head study that we've conducted. We encourage in our own program small group study as long as they feel like it's being fruitful. But I oftentimes don't hear our learners talking about Draw It to Know It when they're in a group. I think if they're going to dedicate the time to small group learning, they're trying to uncover blind spots in their understanding across our curriculum. What I've heard is more so students using Draw It to Know It just by themselves. That's not to say that a group might say, oh, let's go back to that cross-bridge cycling for skeletal muscle, because it was a really good graphic that Dr. Hum used in lecture. Let's look at it together. But oftentimes when students are viewing modules, the feedback I've gotten, it's individually.
Right. Thank you so much for your great presentation, Dr. Hum, and answering all of our questions today. I'd like to thank you so much for providing great insights, and I want to thank the audience for attending today. Now, before you sign off, we hope that you will take a few minutes to complete a brief survey about today's session and any interest you have as far as future biomedical education webinars and potential topics you'd like to see us cover. Thank you so much and have
Thank
a
you.
wonderful day.